Okay, so I'm going to be talking about Parc, which is or was a big developer-funded excavation funded by the Welsh government as developer. Like many of these excavations, our methodology was to use strip, map and sample, which is basically stripping off all the topsoil and plough soil with large machines, down to the glacial clays or gravels, or to the top of undisturbed archaeological deposits. Then sampling any potential archaeology to determine whether it's significant or not, and then full excavation of all significant archaeology found. We actually did the excavation from November 2006 all the way through non-stop, apart from weekends, to July 2008. And then we were back in September 2009 to February 2010, which feels a long time ago, but there was a bit of a pause before the post-ex was done. So the actual final publication was only produced in the summer of 2021. So the whole project actually didn't finish that long ago. This is a bit of a view of the area, showing the location of the site near the A55, heading towards Holyhead. This is fairly early on in the process. We in fact stripped most of these fields all around here. And another view a little bit later on with a very large dumper truck as scale. Basically, this enabled us to do landscape archaeology by excavation, because we're able to look in detail at such a large area. And that revealed archaeology of all sorts of different periods, including this rather nice Middle Iron Age settlement of large stone roundhouses. But this morning, I'm going to be just concentrating on the Mesolithic, Neolithic and Bronze Age from the site. So this sort of shows you where we are. The site is actually on Holy Island, which is a small island off the west coast of Anglesey, known mainly for Holyhead and the ferry terminal up here. And Parc is just on the southern edge of Holyhead. This is an area in the Mesolithic. We know relatively little about the Mesolithic of Anglesey, but there definitely are scatters of finds along the coast. In the Neolithic, there were probably at least 4 chambered tombs on Holy Island, though only 2 have any sort of remains surviving, and various other Neolithic finds on the island. By the Bronze Age, definitely we've got a lot more surviving archaeology visible, with cairns, barrows, kiss burials, and quite a nice selection of standing stones, and on excavated sites, some burnt mounds. This is an area with quite a lot going on in prehistory. And here's a slide of the actual site, showing the area and showing all the main Mesolithic, Neolithic and Bronze Age sites scattered around over that area. The contours on this sort of show that the landscape is quite typical Anglesey landscape, with lots of humps and bumps, rocky outcrops, and running across the site is this valley mire, which was quite important in certain periods, and I'll mention later on. On here, the blue stars are marking Mesolithic sites, or in fact, more usually just a small scatter of artifacts, including a few microliths. But we did get one group of post holes. We were really struggling to get dates from these post holes, but we did manage to get 2 Mesolithic radiocarbon dates from one of the post holes in the middle. Unfortunately, the 2 dates are completely different, so very late Mesolithic and somewhat earlier. So I can't really use those to prove that this was a Mesolithic structure, but it seems fairly likely that it was. The Neolithic was much clearer and easier to understand. Down at the bottom of the site, just beyond the development area, is the best preserved of the chambered tombs on the island, the Trevignath chambered tomb. And just near that, only 90 metres away, we actually found an early Neolithic timber hall. And this is the timber hall under excavation. You can see packing stones in post holes in the slot forming the back wall there. And here's the plan. This is a building that's over 15 metres long and 6 metres wide. So definitely a very big, substantial building. There's some debate. Do we call these houses? Do we call them halls? Quite what were they used for? Are they domestic? Certainly, I think this is big enough and impressive enough to call a hall, which actually then leaves the domestic element a little bit unspecified. You can see from the interpretive plan here, we've got the main post holes, the aisle post holes in black here, and you can see these pairs of post holes which would have supported the roof. And then the north wall was quite well defined with smaller post holes and just a few forming the south wall. I think that this part of the building was perhaps built first. There are very large post holes at the end, and I think this may have been the original gable end. And then this other bay was added on. You can see here that this is actually partly defined by slots, which would probably have held vertical planks. So a little bit of a different style to the rest of the building. Another feature of this, which was really quite intriguing, is that there are definitely some hearths in this building. A few of the ones outside may possibly have been contemporary with the use of it, but two of the main pit hearths actually cut through structural elements of the hall, including this one, which cut away most of one of the aisle post holes. So this could only have been used when the building was largely probably demolished, and then something was going on involving these hearths, perhaps feasting to mark the end of the building. I mentioned this question about whether these are domestic or not. Certainly somebody was living in this. There's plenty of domestic rubbish, flint and chert tools. We didn't find any complete polished stone axes, but there were some flakes from polished stone axes, and a few other sort of interesting items, like some crystal quartz that had been napped, including this tiny little napped crystal quartz tool, and lots of pottery. This was all the typical Irish seaware early Neolithic pottery that we get in this area, undecorated, round bottom bowls. And we did some lipid analysis on this, and all the analysed sherds actually came up as having only dairy fats within them. So these seem to be only used for processing or cooking with dairy products rather than other animal fats. And just north of Timber Hall was a little post hole, and within that we got to what was probably the best find of the whole excavation, which looked like a jet object. In fact, this wasn't jet, it was cannel coal, local cannel coal, but clearly made to look like a jet object. And in fact, this is, or was aiming to be, a large bead, but was unfinished before it was lost, that the hole hasn't been fully drilled through that. And I think this is the earliest jet-like object from Wales. And we got obviously radiocarbon dates from this building. Though early Neolithic rectangular timber buildings always come out at almost exactly the same date, and the use on this one started probably just after 3700 BC, in use for maybe 3 generations before going out of use. And in fact, the hearths that were in use over the building after it being demolished, the dates on those were indistinguishable from the rest of the dates. And actually the hearths contained pottery exactly the same as the rest. So that activity must have taken place almost as soon as the hall was demolished. But perhaps the most important thing about this timber hall was its relationship to the chambered tomb. I mentioned the Trevignus chambered tomb, and here's a very nice photograph of the tomb itself. And luckily, this was actually fully excavated in the late 1970s. So we know that this isn't just a single-phased monument. This actually had 3 different phases of development. And the timber hall was built hiding behind a bedrock outcrop, but at a position where it could actually just see past the outcrop to the chambered tomb. I think the first phase of the chambered tomb was built first. This was actually a very small tomb opening to the north with a small round cairn. And the Neolithic hall was built aligned, pointing at that chambered tomb. This alignment was clearly very important, because then the whole tomb was rebuilt with a long cairn and a chamber at the eastern end, taking on that alignment, which was then further enhanced by the tomb being extended and a new chamber built in. By that third phase, the timber hall was probably out of use. So there was clearly some direct link between the timber hall and the chambered tomb. This alignment, it's clearly not an equinoxial alignment. The fact that the chambers are opening so towards the east suggests that it's looking at the sunrise, but this would perhaps be sunrise in April, around the time of our Easter. So I'd like to suggest that this was marking a spring festival. And exactly what went on in the timber hall at this time, whether it was just used then, whether it was used at other times of the year, whether it was domestic but also used for this festival, is something that we will probably never know. But this is certainly bringing up an importance of this building, which other buildings of these kinds don't often have such a direct relationship to a tomb. But in the early Neolithic, people were not just living in using these big timber halls. There was also a much smaller, more casual settlement on the site. About 300 meters from the timber hall was a hollow in the natural gravels with part of the relic soil surviving, packed full of the same pottery as was found in the timber hall, but all broken up by lots of trampling and flint and other artifacts. And round this there was plenty of stake holes, post holes, little hearths, but no real sort of building as such, so just shelters rather than a building. This area was used over quite a wide period of time, including some beaker pottery, and also there's a very small late Neolithic burnt mound with a very nice arrowhead underneath it. One of the really unusual things about these early Neolithic timber halls is that they were used towards the start of the Neolithic over no more than about 2 centuries, and then they disappear. And later on in the Neolithic, they weren't in use, and people seem to be living in much smaller structures. And usually all you find are pits, very unimpressive little pits like this, but these often have quite a lot of finds in them. This is a happy archaeologist because he's just found this stone mace head in one of these pits. We found a few of these pit groups, which I think indicate where there were small structures, probably no more than 5 meters across, little huts. I think this is definitely sort of suggested by one of these pit groups having a small hearth associated with the pits, which is almost identical to hearths found in the structures found at Trelust and Powys under a barrow. Because they were preserved under a barrow, the stakes forming the walls around those survived. And if you overlay one of those outlines of the stake walls over our hearth there, it fits very nicely. So I think we also had these small structures, maybe not all circular or subcircular. We had some that seemed to be forming a square structure. These pits are usually packed full of artifacts, including pottery. This is Peterborough ware, so we had some Mortlake ware and lots of Fengate, and also grooved ware, some of it really quite fine and exuberant decoration. And got some radiocarbon dates from these, showing the Peterborough ware starting in the mid-Neolithic, running through to maybe about 3000 BC, and then grooved ware from maybe about 2900 BC, running through to the start of the Beaker period. And missing out our bits of Beaker archaeology to save time, going through to the Bronze Age. And for Bronze Age features, we found this very nice group of kist burials, different views of these. And in fact, there were 5 large kists and 3 small ones. I think they were all laid out, they're very close together, all laid out at roughly the same time. And they're so close that I think they were probably then covered over with a round barrow. A barrow of about 10 meters across would have fitted very nicely over them, which makes it rather an unusual feature because there are very few multi-kist barrows known of in Wales. The smaller kists were quite close to the surface and had been somewhat disturbed by ploughing, but the large kists were very well preserved, and their big capstones were securely in place. So when these were lifted, actually the kists themselves were completely empty inside. When I say completely empty, I mean that they were voids, there was no sediment had got in, and there were no burials either. This is quite an acid soil, free draining, so that groundwater would have moved through, and any trace of burials would have leached away. But 2 of them weren't entirely empty because 2 had pots in. We are just tipped over exactly where they were placed in the burials, and these are the pots, and they were a food vessel and a beaker. And in fact, we also had these analysed for lipids, and again these came out as both containing dairy fats. The interesting thing here was that the food vessel had a lot of this fat. It had absorbed a lot of fat and had been reused many times before being placed in the grave, whereas the beaker pot had much less fat and had probably only been used once, and probably had been made specifically to be placed in the grave with its offering of some kind of dairy product. So that Kiss Cemetery was down here. It definitely wasn't on its own. You can see here a circular ring ditch coming out, and this strange feature here. I still don't really understand what this is. You can see it had quite a lot of stone in the upper fill, as if maybe there was a stone revetment, some kind of bank inside. But when it's fully excavated, very deep around a small area. This was originally circular, but then this part of the ditch was infilled, and it was all redug to create this sort of rather odd D shape. No trace of any burials in this, but we did get Bronze Age radiocarbon dates and Bronze Age pottery from the ditch. So this is some kind of Bronze Age monument. Ring ditch, it was almost certainly a ring ditch around a fairly standard barrow, but the barrow itself had entirely gone. I think with any cremation burials that might have been entirely within the barrow, because we found no burials or no trace of burials within that. And actually, about 300 meters north of this, back in 1999, in advance of the building of the A55, there was another barrow found with a ring ditch. This is filled with stone, which again probably revetted the barrow inside. This also had no traces of graves inside, so it probably had cremation burials in the mound. You can see lots of graves here, but these are actually from an early medieval cemetery. And also near this area is a very fine standing stone here. So we seem to have quite a group of Bronze Age monuments. Here you have three very close together, the standing stone and the other barrow on the A55. There's a early 19th century reference to possibly another Kiss grave in this area near the Trevignath tomb. And the tomb itself would also have been very noticeable still in the landscape. So you almost seem to have a ceremonial landscape here on this ridge where you're looking out over the coastal plain. And the Valley Mire that I mentioned here would partly block the route. There was actually an inlet from the sea coming the other way. So there's a very narrow sort of gap here. And I do wonder whether there was actually a Bronze Age routeway up here that the ceremonial monuments are distributed along. But it wasn't just a ceremonial landscape, there was also occupation within that. Probably a Bronze Age timber roundhouse. We got very little dating from that itself, but there was a nice cordoned urn nearby. And also nearby, just close to the Valley Mire, was an area of hard standing, a stone platform, which had a big fire on top of it. And I'm postulating that this actually had a Bronze Age house on it, which had burnt down, causing the fire, because we got very late Bronze Age dates from this. It was next to a field defined by a ditch and another ditch here forming a corner entrance. This would be very useful for getting livestock through this entranceway, and this led through to the Valley Mire, which would be a good place for summer pasture. And deposited at this important, this liminal point in the landscape was a special find. A gold lock ring. You can see this is a 1 centimetre scale. This is a very, very tiny object. But this, from both the composition of the gold and the form, this seems to be late Bronze Age, and is a lock ring, which is called that because it might have been used as a hair decoration. And then just the other side of this possible location of a building was part of an amber bead, which is much harder to date, but equally could fit into the late Bronze Age. So That is taking us through to the very end of the Bronze Age. And in fact, over this area, this is where the mid-Iron Age settlement was built. But at that point, I will stop because we're just looking at that period in this part of the conference. So thank you very much.